Grant, thanks so much for taking the time to chat. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Grant Miller. I'm actually now the Executive Visual Effects Supervisor at Ingenuity Studios because we've been growing and growing, and now we have a whole team of soups under me. So, I've been doing this since 2006-ish. Started off in video games after I decided that I was not going to be a banker. Made the switch over to visual effects and kind of haven't looked back.
That's awesome. Just curious about that. So what were you doing before you got into 3D? You're a banker?
I'm from the Midwest, and in the Midwest, you kind of are picking like 6 different jobs that they have available. So it's like you're going to be a doctor, or a dentist, or a lawyer, or a banker. Both my parents were bankers, so it seemed like banker was a pretty obvious choice. Went to school, University of Missouri, and just didn't like it. Left at Thanksgiving break and came home and was like, now what? And I think that's something I always kind of am keen to talk to young people about. Like, our industry, you don't really need to, you don't really need to go to school. A lot of it you can learn online. We've had a fantastic bunch of people come kind of straight out of high school, kind of into the studio as interns, just grow and become compositing supervisors and stuff like that. For me at the time, I didn't really do art class in school. I didn't really, art just wasn't kind of a job. And I think now that's much more available. Now you've got like, kids in the 6th grade learning Blender and stuff like that, which is fantastic to see. But yeah, back in the day, it was just like, it just wasn't really viable. But I had always liked playing video games, and I thought someone, is making these games. That seems way more fun than banking. So let's see if we can go do that. So yeah, went to a little art school in Phoenix called UAT that had, it was like one of 3 schools at the time that really kind of had a specialty in video game art, and got a bachelor's in multimedia, and then came out to LA to look for work, and landed in games. Worked at some small places. Worked at EA. Went back to a smaller place and kind of graduated up to being the lead artist there. And then they canned the game we were working on after like a year and a half. And I was like, what am I doing? One of the artists that was working for me there came back to Ingenuity, which was really small at the time. I think it was like, 5 or 6 people or something like that, and said, hey, my boss Grant knows this stuff and, can probably do this job too. But I didn't have a reel, didn't really know probably as much as I let on about visual effects at the time. So I, hopped over and, basically learned how to do my job in the evenings, and then went and did my job the next day.
Yeah, I got 1,000 questions about that. Even just kind of making that conscious decision to go and do something which I'm assuming at the time might feel a bit risky. Like, video games sounds a bit more like a pipe dream than, wait a minute, you get paid to do this stuff? Like, what was that like, just kind of first discovering art, let's say, for video games, and kind of seeing that as a possible career to kind of go after?
It was definitely felt risky, for sure. And, in kind of talking it out at the time, I could have graduated with an MBA and gone and, made 6 figures as a banker. And it's like, white picket fence and, 2.5 kids, and I don't know. It didn't seem like that was for me. And I think I was fortunate to have, the support of my family to kind of take that swing, which I think, a lot of people aren't as fortunate. So really appreciate that.
And just touching on this too, because I just think it's an interesting topic before we get into everything else, but just moving to a different city, especially moving to LA to look for work. I mean, again, I'm just kind of curious what that experience is like, just because I think a lot of people have it in their mind that they get off the bus and they're like, okay, I've arrived. Okay, everybody, like, get ready. And, it obviously isn't that simple. And I think a lot of times that naivete can work for you or against you. There's a bit of a rude shock of just thinking everything should be easy. I got here. Where do I go to get famous, or work in games or movies or whatever it's going to be?
Totally. My first job was, an unpaid internship at Naked Sky, which was working on Destroy All Humans 2. You have to be able to kind of stay afloat for a minute. And I think that's that's a tough thing for a lot of people to do. I was fortunate to have a friend that moved out with me from college, so we at least kind of like were, you know, there in the trenches together, and you know, he got a job and I got a job, you know, and that was really a blessing. I didn't really know anyone in LA. I don't have any family there or anything like that, so it was nice to be able to, you know, kind of at least have a built-in friend.
I think it's important. I don't know too many people who haven't moved out with somebody else, because I think, again, it's just that way, you know, you've got someone to drag you out and vice versa, and at the same time, if someone wins, then usually they'll bring the other person into their jobs.
Exactly. Rising tide raises all ships kind of thing. You know, you're like, all right, you got a job, now you get me a job.
I always think of it with students. It's whenever we hire a new student anywhere I work, it's usually first thing I say is, who are all the most talented people in your class? Let's get them as well, because it's usually the case that there's like that hidden gem of one or two people that just seem to be freaks of nature, and you get a chance to get in there before anyone else gets their grubby mitts on them.
Absolutely. And the talent coming out of schools these days is fantastic. I mean, we've always had a really good relationship with a lot of kind of area schools, but you know, it's so much of our workforce is kind of homegrown, you know, so it's like their first job out of school, and then, you know, 4 or 5, 6 years later, they're, you know, a visual effects supervisor on the job. So I always really like to see that stuff.
Just to touch on that for a second, yeah, I'm kind of curious to see your thoughts on this, because I feel like the economy, I guess, of artists has changed very drastically over the years. Like, it used to be kind of like everyone would fight everybody for a job, and it could still be the same, but I feel like these days artists have really the pick of the litter in terms of, like, if you're talented, even if you don't have much experience, but if you're talented, then there's so much work out there, versus before, where scarcity is like 10 artists applying for one job. It's now, you know, there's enough work out there that most people are able to go out of school right into working, which is a bit unheard of.
I would definitely agree with that. I think as long as you're coming out of school and talented, and, you know, have a good reel of, I think, stuff that is production leaning. I think that's probably the biggest reel tip that I would give is, you know, take a shot from a film and just try to copy that shot. Like, that's so much more effective as a reel than like, here's, you know, 6 little quirky tests that I, you know, followed a tutorial on YouTube. You know what I mean? It's like, you want that critical thinking. But yeah, I would definitely say that, you know, as long as you're talented coming out of school, you've got a job pretty much straight away. And, you know, I think that's cooling off a bit. You know, we were in overdrive mode after COVID, and I think we're now kind of seeing like it at least calm down to some level of equilibrium, you know, with respect to the work.
Yeah, that's a good point too. It's kind of funny because I get a lot of pushback on this, but I believe the same thing. It's just like, it's what you call market fit with sales, which is that if you want to get a job at, I don't know, working on the next Kong movie, then have a giant creature smashing apart a building. It pretty much says, like, I can deliver on the thing that you're looking for. People seem to be like, no, you got to have a story and don't replicate what other studios have done. But if anything, you're showing that I'm fully aligned with the results that you're trying to achieve. So
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if I can look at your reel and think, oh, we have a shot like that right now, or, oh, we have a shot like that coming up, or, you know, we just did a shot like that, like, I'm happy as a clam, because I know you can come in and just produce those same results for us. That might not be true for, you know, other visual effects companies, or other, you know, if you're working at, you know, Pixar or something like that, maybe that's not what they're after. But I mean, I'm with you. I would think that would be the case. Like, if you can show me a Pixar style character animated in a Pixar style fashion, like, you know, it's just like all the Blizzard art tests. Everyone, you know, they just, if they can nail that art style, they can get a job on, you know, World of Warcraft or whatever back in the day.
that's right. And I was curious, going to Ingenuity, especially so small, like, what's the head count now? You guys are opening up in London right now. Like, you're expanding even more. So how big are you guys?
Yeah, I mean, we're just north of 600 now, which is, you know, crazy considering we were 6 or so when I joined. You know, so that's been really special to watch. One of the things we've always kind of pushed for is it's still feeling small, even at that size. You know, so I mean, I'm talking to the CG team 3 times a week. We still have an all hands company meeting every Monday. Like, it's still, you know, try to kind of feel like a, you know, still a mom and pop shop kind of situation.
Is there any secret to doing that? I'm just curious, like the studio that I'm at the moment, we're going through a massive growth spurt, which is good considering the climate of everything at the moment. But it's also for me, like I've seen it a lot of times where usually go from like 30 to 70, suddenly there's another level of management that needs to be implemented, and bit by bit 150, there's always more infrastructure, which makes it very hard to kind of stay personable when things grow so quickly. For you, like what's the secret that you found that really kind of keeps things more personable and make everyone feel like they're part of a family versus a big corporate machine?
Totally. There's a handful of things. We're quite wide on the jobs that we work on. So the actual team that you're working on with your project is still, a dozen people or so. So you kind of have these amorphous little bubbles of like a dozen people or so that are jamming away on a project. And I think that really helps, people stay tight with each other and people kind of work together closely, as opposed to, everything kind of going up through some hierarchy and then down the other side. So it's on that job, visual effects supervisor, comp lead, CG lead, and the artists, and that's it. So it's a very small pyramid. And I think that's a really big contributor for me. And then also we make it a priority, which I think, comes top down and then kind of permeates throughout, from a culture perspective. But we do jokes, we do dad jokes at the end of our Monday morning meeting. And I'm just like constantly kind of out in the world fishing for like what a silly dad joke to share in that meeting is. Like little stuff like that. It seems silly, but it's like when you can have one of the owners of the company, on a call every week, just being a human, I think that also just really moves the needle.
That's great. Yeah, one thing that we started doing, I'm up at Refuge in Portland at the moment, and we do our all hands on Fridays, and we hired a new VFX editor recently, and so it ended up being a thing where it's like you put weird bloopers or play boss things that broke, whatever, to silly stuff in a folder throughout the week, and then we compile a reel at the end of the week to watch together. So there's always just some crazy things that have happened that are inexplainable to anyone else. It's just like, what the hell is that we all get to laugh at together. So just a good company culture, I think, is really important across the board.
It really is top down. I mean, and once it stops being a priority, it's really hard to get it back, so I think you see a lot of places really, take a hard turn towards being, corporate and structured, because now we're a big company and we have to put on that hat. And it's like, I don't think you do. Look at all the silly ridiculousness at all of these tech companies in San Francisco, like they're all doing the same silly stuff that they were doing when they were 20 people, now they just have free dry cleaning.
It's an Equinox inside of a tech company. For you, just to talk a little bit about your career, you first getting into visual effects to where you are now, you seem to have very huge momentum throughout your career. I was kind of curious for you, like what were some of the mindsets around that? Was it just more going into Ingenuity and giving it all you got? But at the same time, like, do you have any things that you kind of look back on as being really big catalysts to a lot of the success you had in your career?
Ingenuity, when I joined, was doing primarily music videos, and I think that was really a great space for me to kind of grow up in visual effects.
Shorter budgets.
Yeah, as a small studio, you're creating, 3.5, 4 minutes of content on a 3 or 4 week turnaround. Like, you have to wear a lot of hats. You have to just kind of, cut through the cornfield and just kind of get stuff on screen. You know what I mean? And you have people now that kind of come out of school really talented in certain disciplines, but that aren't used to that production environment and the requirements of that, in terms of just getting content out and like, what's the quickest way to do this shot? Can I take just a photo of this thing and put it on some geometry and put it back there and it goes by in 3 seconds and that's fine. It's like, there's just I think an established methodology maybe of how all this stuff is done now that, when we were really starting out wasn't the case, because my business partner, David, and I both don't come from another studio. And I think that's, another one of the things that's kind of, for better or worse, always kind of made Ingenuity different is that we really have like a first principles kind of approach to visual effects in terms of just figuring out like, what is the good way to do this? How do we want to do this as a company? Because we don't have like, well, this is how it's done as a, as a mantra. So I think a lot of the momentum kind of came from that, in just that I could do everyone at the studio's, job, and it was then easy to manage all of them because I could, very effectively kind of give them notes and talk to them in their language, that sort of thing.
No, I think that's great. What are your thoughts around that in terms of the trap of overcomplicating everything? Do you usually try to imprint that on all your artists? What if it were simple, or keep it simple, stupid, rather than like,
Yes.
How many nodes can I fit into a node graph?
My goodness, absolutely. I mean, our Tuesday 3D meeting is a bit of a longer, it's like a 45-minute kind of walk through a setup that we've done, or, kind of go through oh, I saw someone build this, by hand in Maya. Here's how we could build it procedurally, that sort of thing. Or it's a lot of stuff like that. And always in those, I'm, harping on the same stuff, which is just like, what's the simplest version? Get this working first and then add complexity, like test a little bit of the fire and then make the whole fire, just all that stuff. Those are also things that you kind of come across working in production that, aren't always obvious when you're, just kind of like what's the most straightforward path isn't necessarily the quickest sometimes.
And you mentioned having kind of mini classes to either break down stuff you've seen or actual scenes that you guys are working on. How important is that to kind of implement training and guidance into your studio, whether it is mentorship or whether it is classes, things like that?
I think it's really important. It's something that I kind of pull over from games. At the video game place that I was at before moving to Ingenuity, we would do every Friday like a group review of everyone's work and kind of talk about techniques. How are we doing this? How are we getting, what's the texture on this stuff look like? What's the technique to do the paint or the grass or whatever? And, I think it helps everyone keep in alignment on kind of methodology. And, truthfully, we have a ton of, on the Houdini side, that's our main, lighting, shading, scene assembly, in addition to, effects, CFX, et cetera. So we have just a ton of HDAs that are kind of accumulated over the years that if you have worked here for 2 weeks, you just don't know about, so coming across all that stuff is challenging when it's just a list of, 200 HDAs that you have to read through. But if you see it kind of out in the world used in practice, I feel like it, it becomes much easier.
I guess one other quick question, but do you do postmortems after projects, things like that? I've talked to some studios who see it as like a negative thing, like, oh, we don't kind of spread that kind of negative culture, but it's just like, no, like you celebrate the wins and the lessons as well. So
yeah, and it's both on those. I mean, our post-mortem doc that we're filling out is like, what did we do well? What did we do poorly? What went smoothly? What was rough? And I think I relish, like, I don't even care as much about what went well. It's great that it went well, but I'm there for what we did poorly, because that's how you learn and that's how you get better. And I think, for us as a studio, those notes and that feedback on how we operate can come from anyone at any time. And that's also, something we really try to pull out of people during those meetings. And on that front, like when, we get senior people coming from other studios, I'm like, hey, open up an email and just like have it sitting there. And for the first 3 weeks, just toss stuff in there that you think is weird or dumb and send it to me, and I'm happy to have that feedback because I don't, I've never worked at ILM. So I don't know, how they're doing something that is super efficient or how they're doing something that, we do better. Like, let me know that stuff. And then we can capitalize on it,
That's something that I've started doing recently is just new hires from big studios like Scanline, places like that. It's a chance to have a meeting about like, what are the tools that others are using that's like their go-to day-to-day stuff. And yeah, I think taking an extra step of, you're right, having like an active text file, something that they can just start throwing their brain farts into as a chance to put their frustrations or ahas, or even like, hey, this thing is great, I've never seen this before, it can be extremely valuable just to really help kind of pick up like some of the things that you might be caught, down in the trenches doing and not really being too self-aware about. So I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, you only have, that first impression once, and then you're like, oh, I know that I have to just close out of this dialogue and hit okay 3 times to do this thing. And like, for the people that are here, it's just, it's second nature. And the new person comes in, they're like, why is this way? And you're like, oh yeah, we should fix that. It's just easy to kind of turn a blind eye to stuff sometimes.
With Ingenuity, is there any particular projects that stood out for you that you're particularly proud of?
I actually get this question on interviews a lot, like not interviews with people, but like people that I'm interviewing. They're like, what's your favorite project in Ingenuity? And it's different projects for different reasons. I would say certainly a standout for me, we did a video for Taylor Swift called Ready For It. That's like kind of a just VFX tour de force. It's got CG creatures and tons of, she's in a glass box for the entire time that was fake. It's just a lot of really, really neat looking stuff. And it was, I think, like a three week, maybe 4 week turnaround. And it was at a time, it's kind of one of the last big music video jobs that we did kind of before COVID. And when, everyone was in the studio, just working quick and, moving and shaking, and just a really nice time. I think we were probably only 150 people or something then. So it was, just small. And we all, I think, went out after the job was over, and it was just kind of just a nice, lot of good memories on that one. There's a lot of more recent jobs that are, I mean, it was awesome to work on Night Agent and have that be so successful. I think the people working on the show side, kind of like, we didn't know that we were doing kind of the opening scene of the show and the closing, like, ending climax scene of the show. So it was one of those things where we watched the trailer and it was just like the Ingenuity show reel of work on the show. And you like watch the show and you're like, oh my God, the first shot is like our shot, it's like, so it's always nice to see. And I don't watch, to be honest, a ton of what we do, because there's so much of it and there's only so many hours in the day. But I mean, we binge watched Night Agent in like a weekend. It was really great. So it's always good to, work on something that you actually enjoy.
Yeah, it always says something if you're actually watching the shows that you worked on, opposed to like, I don't want to hear that name again. So that's great. You mentioned job interviews with artists as well. I'm kind of curious about that. Like, what are the kind of things that you look for when interviewing artists? And I know that's a bit of a generic question, but I'll also throw in, what are some of the red flags that you tend to look for as well?
I think the red flags is maybe the easier question. Definitely when people are hopping around studios every 4 months, I'm like, no, pass. I think when people have a reel of just enormous shots at huge studios, that's also a pass.
Get that 2% that you contributed to the shot usually.
Yeah, and you also probably just like used the setup that your supervisor did for the blasts in the background. And that's not to disparage those shots. Like, someone did really hard, good work on them, but they probably aren't applying for a job. They probably still work at that large studio. It's funny, you see those same shots like on 17 different reels. Like that job finishes up and everyone's got like the same 4 shots on their reel, and you're like, and then the little ticker on the bottom, if you're lucky, if they've included it, is like foot dust or something. You're like, okay,
background foot dust.
Yeah, background sparks, and you're like, that's, I mean, cool. But I oftentimes in those cases will go to their Vimeo and look up their student reel, and that's the reel that I care about. Like, I care about your talent and what you're doing, and I'd rather a 1.5-minute reel of your own stuff that looks good, or of stuff that you really owned and did all the pieces of, for sure. I always say to people that we can teach you to work at Ingenuity, but we can't teach taste. Like, we can't teach you to make good decisions and know what nice things look like. We're always kind of prioritizing that in reels and in hires, for sure. Otherwise, you just burn through a ton of notes, kind of getting to something that's decent, and you don't spend your time making it great. There's a lot of people that are unfortunately very technically capable at the software and at driving the kind of train, but they just don't know any destinations. They're not really able to kind of like what is the composition of this shot? What would make the lighting here better? What's the, you're doing an explosion, but like, let's dirty it up and have it be asymmetrical and it'll be weird, and it's like, technically you made a fine explosion, but it just doesn't look cool or good.
I said that before.
Those we'll get, but
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Like, someone can do a tutorial, and I feel like explosions are a good example of that, where it's just like, if someone shows me a good explosion, that's great, but show me a good explosion that actually moves and hits the right beats and emphasizes scale and all, has character to it. Most people are going to roll their eyes. Like, you can't give character to an whatever it's going to be, but it's those are the things that I think make everything. These days, I think it's pretty easy to make stuff look good by default. You can throw in some lights and some awesome textures from Megascans or somewhere, and you got something. But to actually take it to that extra step where it is something that people feel or really hits the scope that you've been given, like it's everything.
And it's a big hurdle. I mean, it's a big hurdle for still people that work here today. So I think it's an important thing to kind of keep in mind when I think people are looking at their own work. And that's another thing I always tell people when they first start. It's like, hey, when you're posting something, write what you have done and write what you're going to do still. Like, hey, this is a V1, like the grunge is a little much, I'm going to calm that down, or the explosion, the trails feel like silly or too puffy or whatever. Like, letting people know that you're looking at your own stuff and being critical of it, like, just is super important
for me, especially if it's something that I'm really not blown away by. I'm always curious to get them to walk me through their shot, but more importantly, as you said, what they're intending to do, because it's sometimes things are just not ready yet, and that's fine. But as long as they're self-aware that, like, oh yeah, I need to tone down that ridiculousness over here and do more over here, then that kind of gives you reassurance, like, okay, cool, I can be hands off. But if someone's like, oh, I think it's done, that's when it's like, whoa, okay, we gotta
it's
go
such
back.
a red flag. I'm like, if you're halfway done and know it, that's fine. If you're halfway done and think you're done, like, it's a problem for sure. I also always push people to find reference. I'm like, hey, this is feeling a little weird. Let's go find a reference that feels similar to what you're trying to do and match that. And then they'll, through that process, help themselves.
Do you have any advice to help people train their eye? Like, this is something I've started to think a lot about recently. I guess maybe validating my own job, but it's just like, why do I have to tell someone what to do? Why can't they see it themselves?
I completely understand that question. It's like, you look at stuff sometimes and you're like, this is obviously not it, or this is obviously needs to be, X, Y, and Z or whatever. I think a lot of it is unfortunately like laps around the track, laps around like consuming, like I watch other studios' reels. I follow like all the other big visual effects studios, and I watch almost every reel that they come out with, and I think like that goes in your kind of mental bank to recall of like, oh yeah, I saw this, these explosions, they always have these, papers floating around, or these, these spark shooters that come out, like we should add those to ours, or that when they're skidding around in this car, like they've got clearly simmed dust on here and simmed particles on, just like all those little things. You have to prioritize noticing that stuff, and I think if you're just doing the work and you're not trying to get kind of better at the macro, the soft skills, it's easy to miss it.
Yeah, that's so important. Yeah, and again, it's about looking for like, what's that 2% bump that you can get a couple here and a couple there, and after a while it's night and day different, just seeing what other people see and trying to incorporate that into your own work, rather than thinking, I've got all the answers, I'm a badass, I know what I'm doing. That's the humility too, to kind of look at, well, what am I not seeing that others might pick up on?
Yeah, and I'm doing that after 15 years, 20 years almost in the industry. You know what I mean? So I think people kind of get out of school and think they're done. And like, we don't use anything I learned in school. You know, we stopped using 3D Studio Max ages ago. Like, you couldn't even text, the Substance Painter didn't exist, you know, like you were texturing UVs in Photoshop, you know, like it's kind of crazy to think that you're done, you know, or that you've mastered any aspect of this, you know.
There's definitely a lot to it. I'm curious too, just to kind of pivot for a second. I'd love to talk a bit about some of the projects you guys worked on. Just briefly on The Boys, like what did Ingenuity contribute to that show?
We did some crowd work. We do a lot of their graphics, actually. We have a really fantastic graphics team, and they have a lot of, you know, just kind of interesting, you know, graphic cutscenes and stuff like that, you know, treatments and stuff. So we do a lot of that. We did some scars, some blood, you know, kind of standard like Boys, some of the healing stuff where she's, like her spine is coming back together and stuff like that, healing wounds and stuff like that. So a lot of kind of miscellaneous random stuff, but it's all stuff that, you know, that needs to get done for the show.
That's great. What about The Walking Dead?
We do a ton of zombie kills, a lot of CG zombies. You know, anytime you're like running over a zombie's head, they don't let them use any weapons on set. So, you know, whether it's an axe or a sword or a bow and arrow or whatever, it's always done in CG. And then we actually did, I think it was for Walking Dead. We work on like Walking Dead, Fear of the Walking Dead. Like we work on so many of the Walking Dead shows, but I think it was for Walking Dead. We did a full CG kind of ending shot for the final episode of the last season. They're like kind of craning up over their fort, and there's just a big, you know, kind of beautiful vista that wasn't beautiful enough, so we just made it all again in the computer. And I think that's something that we've really kind of pushed into, you know, a lot. I think COVID really kind of accelerated the, you know, the CG set extension work that we do, because you couldn't go anywhere. You know, so it used to be that I would travel kind of all over the place to supervise jobs, and now it's like, you know, you're filming in LA, got a green screen, and then, you know, the rest is kind of created in post. And it's something we really enjoy. You know, I think it's something that benefits from our pipeline being, you know, USD and Solaris, and kind of just really set up for and geared towards handling those larger scenes is also something that we did a lot of when we were doing music videos. You know, because there you know, you're never building some big environment or doing some grand location or something like that. It's always in the computer. So it's been a really natural fit for us, and I think something we really enjoy.
As a VFX supervisor, what's your go-to gear that you always bring on set?
I just bring my phone. I have an iPhone 13, and it'll take, I use Scaniverse to do LiDAR. You can take, you know, HDRIs with it. There's an app called HDRI, but EYE, that'll do like a totally fine HDRI for, you know, for what you need. You can, you know, take measurements with it of stuff. You can write notes in it. Like the photos in it are fantastic. You know, so I just bring my phone, and that's my gear. I have a pocket, one of those pocket Macbeth charts, you know, that I'll take with photos, and that's kind of the extent of it. We're always really production friendly. I think from the music video days, again, like in terms of what our, you know, on-set supervision is, you know, so we're not out there after every take kind of slowing everything down and gumming up the system. It's, you know, and yet again, no disrespect to people that are doing that for bigger shows, and for, you know, I benefit being the visual effects supervisor on the job, in that it's my company that has to go do the work at the end of the day. So like, if anyone complains about it, it's like it's my problem, you know. Whereas a lot of the visual effects supervisors on the client side are like, really, they're data collecting. They're like, because who knows who's going to, you know, be on the other side of that, and what they're going to need. So they're kind of covering their own butts, so to say. Whereas I can be a little more laissez-faire.
Yeah, it's when you get the overnights sent to you, and it's just kind of like, what the hell is that I gotta work with? Yeah, it can be pretty problematic. No, that's great. Actually, mutual friend Chad, we're in my backyard one time comparing iPhone to LiDAR to photogrammetry to just kind of see like what was the quickest versus the best results. So it's kind of interesting to see like iPhone with photogrammetry like these days like is just those two alone combined, like you can get some pretty amazing results. So yeah, the tech stack or the footprint, I guess, is definitely shrinking these days compared to having to carry on like a giant Manfrotto tripod with big
Exactly.
Nodal Ninja, and yeah, gets heavy.
Yeah. We have a little pocket Theta 360 cam that that I'll take out if it's like a really intense bunch of HDRIs that we need. But most of the time you're at like 3 locations, and it takes a minute to grab them with the HDRI app, but like you've got those minutes. I mean, if you've ever been on a film set, you're sitting around doing nothing for 70% of the time,
I guess like I'm just kind of curious too, more from a bird's eye view. When you first hear of a project, like all the way through to delivering a project, what are the kind of broad strokes with that, just for anyone who's not too familiar?
Sure. I mean, for us, we really, like I said, try to be as involved as early as possible. So we'll try and coerce people into sending us like, send us the script so we can break it down, and we can say like, this location that's in here for 2 pages, like just put up a green screen. We've built some of that stuff already, or are you trying to get a permit downtown for this one little scene, that sort of stuff. Like just trying to kind of save production from big stuff and costly stuff, kind of breaking those things down early. We do a lot of times these days kind of concept art throughout the process, and little tests, stuff on assets that we know we're going to need. We'll get started building early. That way we're just really as well prepared as we can be when the show hits. I think streaming has really stacked stuff up from a schedule standpoint. When we're doing network television, it's a very kind of regular cadence, and those have also gotten tighter, but it's at least like, you have 1 episode, maybe 2 episodes in house at a given time. Whereas a lot of the streaming shows we work on, you've got like 5 and 6 episodes in house. So you really have to just kind of have all your ducks in a row ahead of time so that you're just implementing, the stuff you've already figured out in kind of pre-pro. But you have to pull that stuff because people, that I think a lot of times the client side isn't always keen on like, yes, there's definitely going to be this creature in the show, or yes, there's definitely going to be this effect and it's coming your way. But it makes a huge difference in terms of what the quality is that you can get on the other side. And then through post, we're just kind of meeting regularly with the clients. We really try to kind of take people on the journey with us, so here's the rough of this, here's what the concept looks like, here's this is how this explosion is going to look kind of roughed in here, just making sure that we're all kind of traveling on the same path through the woods and getting to the same house on the other side.
That's cool. What advice would you give for people in terms of handling clients and having a smooth journey through that forest to the house on the other side?
I think it varies a lot more than people maybe think. We have certain clients that we work with that are really just a dream and are happy to just kind of be, hands off and let us do a great job. And, we have other clients that I think want to kind of be overly prescriptive sometimes. And like, visual effects supervisors that maybe, knew how to do the work 5 or 10 years ago, but haven't done it since. And they're like, oh yeah, just do this. And you're like, that's really not the way. Like, just tell me what you want and we'll kind of get it done. Just recognizing that you're hiring a professional visual effects company that cares about your job and wants to do a good job, and like letting them a little bit, I think would, does go a long way. And I think it's a process, right? Like we want to make sure we're headed to where the client wants us to go, and make sure we're all kind of getting there happy. But it can be a lot smoother or a lot bumpier, I think, depending on some of those factors. So it's definitely interesting to see though, the variety of jobs. I think because we work on so much, you kind of get exposed to a lot of different personalities and methodologies.
You definitely do. I think you're absolutely right. Like, it's one of those things that for a lot of clients, the perception can either be, great, this person is taking one of the many headaches I have away from me, so that way they can go and figure it out and come back with a solution, versus someone feeling like they've lost control and need to be very overbearing. Usually the ones who are more excited to see, like, what have you got to show me today, versus like, what the fuck do you have to show me today? It's night and day different.
Yeah, it's top down from that client in terms of how that process goes, and I think it's also interesting, the people that I feel like give you the most trust are often the same people that will give you the most prep, so it's almost self-fulfilling that those jobs go better because you're kind of set up for success, whereas the people who are kind of trying to come in and get a little too nitty-gritty, oftentimes those jobs are super tight turnaround or whatever, and you're like, of course this isn't fantastic, it's our second version and we had 3 days to do it, like it's just gonna be okay. It's probably the peak is like slightly better than this, which isn't what anyone wants to hear, but it's the truth sometimes. It's like I always say, like 9 women don't make a baby in a month. It's like some of this stuff just takes time.
I love that. Grant, appreciate you taking the time to chat. Where can people go to find out more about you and also Ingenuity?
IngenuityStudios.com. The careers page is up there if you want to join our merry band of folk and check out all the stuff we do. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, again, thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Of course, man. You as well.